I'm so pleased to welcome you this morning for what I think might be the most important question of our weekend and perhaps of this geopolitical moment. Is it fascism yet? And I know this might feel at turns a little tongue-in-cheek, but it can also feel very heavy. Terms like fascism and authoritarianism, they have a deep history, often have a lot of context attached to them. They can be used and abused. I'm of a generation that remembers Godwin's law, that if you invoked either of those terms on the internet, you automatically had lost the argument. I don't feel that that applies as much in our current political context. So hopefully we can unpack some of those complexities to learn how to identify some of the red flags that we may be seeing around us, and to understand some of the trends around the erosion of our liberal democracies around the world and how that's manifesting here at home in Canada, what we can do about it as well. So our first speaker this morning, Dr. Thorlakson, she will be speaking on democracies under threat, fascism and authoritarianism in the 21st century. Dr. Thorlakson is a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science here at the University of Alberta, where she's also the founding director of the European Union Centre for Excellence. Her research has examined party competition and representation, political incivility, and the politics of energy transition. She's the author of Multi-Level Democracy, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2020, and she holds a PhD from LSE and has held a John Monnet postdoctoral fellowship at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. So I would like to welcome Dr. Thorlakson for our first talk this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that introduction, and wonderful to see you all this morning, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've just, as a provocation, made a last-minute change to my title, Democracy in Dangerous Times, and it was inspired by a news article that I saw this week, and it was the scariest thing that might have slipped your attention because it's a piece of news coming from Europe. As Rebecca mentioned, I'm a scholar of the European Union, and this week the European Commission met and announced a new policy initiative, and they'd like to do all sorts of coordinating to create a more seamless single market and a more seamless cooperation. And what they've announced this week is a cooperation that is intended to allow them to more efficiently, more swiftly move armies and military equipment across the continent of Europe. They're sitting down and combing through the regulations that cause delays in approval from certain member states. In certain member states, you need to provide advance authorization, warning, and receive authorization in order to permit the transport of military materials or troops through these Schengen countries. In other parts of this project, it's a matter of looking at the bridges that exist to make sure that they are strong enough and wide enough to support the transport of military equipment. That gave me pause. And it's a reminder of the world that we live in now, the world where a few years ago, the Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, had reminded us, and he said, we are in a pre-war moment. What he meant there was 1939. That was what he was alluding to. And so now we see the European Union, created in order to help secure peace, is using its tools of coordination and cooperation to ensure that it's able to quickly defend its eastern borders. Now I mention this because when we talk about democracy, its development, its support, its erosion, I regard this as part of a struggle in geopolitics, that this is part of a wider struggle that we see ongoing now, accelerated now, in terms of either defending what's often described as a Western rules-based democratic order, or the rise of autocracy championed by states such as Russia or China. We are 20 years out from what various scholars of democracy and indices would recognize as the high watermark of democratic development around the world. which started in the late 19th and early 20th century as monarchies transitioned to parliamentary democracies, and then we had the second wave of democratization after the Second World War, then the third wave coming in the 1970s and 1980s when authoritarian regimes in South America, in Southern Europe, Asian states, Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea, transitioning to democracy, and we had this buildup. However, since 2006, we have seen backsliding and the start of a global democratic recession. And we've seen in particular, if you look at this chart, this green line shows you the percentage of states in the world and percentage of people living in the world in states that are designated as free. The purple line, you'll notice, remains relatively stable. Those are the not free states. And so what has happened after 2006 is we've seen this shift where we have this plummeting in the states that are classified as free, and their place taken by states that we would characterize as partly free. And so we've seen this backsliding towards what we might call electoral autocracies or hybrid regimes. And so states in which there are some freedoms, and so competitive authoritarian states. And the dimensions of democracy in which we see the greatest decline are in areas such as transparency and in other dimensions of the rule of law. And so when we talk about the rule of law, we're talking about accountability and constraints on government power, such as the presence of a media, of courts, of opposition parties that are functional. We're talking about the absence of corruption. We're talking about open government, so the capacity for us as citizens to see what government is doing, whether this means a government that publishes data on the policy outcomes that we are seeing, whether it's the existence of channels where as citizens we can make access of information requests, or ombuds offices where we can make complaints or file petitions. We talk about fundamental rights, order and security. Most states in the world do quite well in order and security. That's the last one to erode, and in authoritarian regimes, order and security usually remains quite stable. Regulatory enforcement and civil and criminal justice. And the Economic Intelligence Unit, which is one of the many organizations that track various indicators of democratic performance and rule of law. So just last year, in 2024, we found declines in every single region of the world except for Western Europe, which is the one region that held stable. If we look at Canada, we do quite well, actually. In a ranking out of 143 countries, we rank about 13th on the World Justice Project Rule of Law rankings. For comparison, the United States ranks about 27th. So why has this tide of democracy turned around the world? We could point to lots of different factors, and one of these, I would say, has been a discrediting and then an abandonment of democratic leadership by democratic countries. In the past, it was very often the United States that provided this leadership. Think about after the Second World War and the use of soft diplomacy tools, the launch of Radio Free Europe to spread these ideas about democracy. This is about normative power and spreading a narrative of democracy, promoting these values and these ideas. After the invasion of Iraq, these ideals started to sound pretty hypocritical and hollow to certain countries in the world. And then we got to a point when we saw the Trump administration where we saw an abandonment altogether of these ideals, where today we're at a situation where the United States is sitting down with Hungary to discuss how it can provide funding to the Hungarian state, which for Hungary, their funds from the European Union are now frozen because of their rule of law problems. And so we have the United States actively aiding and abetting authoritarianism. We have social trends like the rise of the internet and social media, which can provide an ideal ecosystem for fostering division and disinformation. And we have trends such as, over the years, increasing income as well as wealth inequality. So these fundamental contextual conditions that are not friendly to democracy. In these challenges, how do we kind of measure and describe what's going on? How do we get a sense of where we're at, what is that threat, and how to describe that? And I think these definitions and descriptions are important because they help point us in a direction of what to expect and also what we can do. So it's authoritarianism that I want to really talk about and focus on. And this word authoritarianism, if we've seen this backsliding from democracy to authoritarianism, what do we mean by it? We can approach this idea, this concept on different levels. We can talk about it at the individual level. And so approaches from political psychology would argue that we can understand this as a set of value orientations. And my colleague Feo will be talking to us about that and the role that that plays. But political psychologists point to the triad of intolerance, of racial, moral, and political intolerance, the need to create in-groups and out-groups, a valuing of obedience and order, the need to punish people who don't conform, and the dislike of complexity and change. And these value orientations kind of work together and become supercharged or activated when we are under conditions of threat, when our world becomes chaotic, when we fear that we lose our status, when times are not so good and we're not sure what's going to happen next. These individual level approaches are really important. Feo will get into it more, but I want to then ask, well, is authoritarianism an attribute of followers, so of citizens, of the people, or is it an attribute of leaders? And so this is kind of what I want to get into a little bit more, because if we look at the system level, we can take those same values of authoritarianism and understand these as ways of structuring political competition. And so political scientists in the 1980s, a political scientist named Ronald Inglehart, had looked at the way that political scientists describe competition in left-right terms. We're all familiar with terms right-wing and left-wing to describe minimal state involvement in the economy or maximal. But he said, we are now, to understand politics from about the 1980s onward, when we see new green parties and protest parties, and we have to think about another dimension of competition, which is distinct from left and right. And so we can understand political parties along what he called a Galtan dimension, green, alternative, libertarian, or at the other pole, traditional, authoritarian, and nationalist. And so these political parties then take positions of promoting traditional family values, law and order, supporting a state role to impose a moral code. That might sound a bit familiar from this week in Alberta politics. Nationalist, pro-security. Now, at the same time, we could also look at regime behavior, and we can use the term authoritarianism to describe illiberal or anti-democratic practices of countries, leaders, or parties. And so key features of this are unfair elections, majoritarianism, capture of democratic institutions that suppress pluralism, that's a big thing, and rewriting of history for political purposes. That narrative element, that's really important, and we find it in so many aspects. Now, authoritarianism, in our new age of democratic backsliding, it's changed a bit from the old days. And so here we have a picture of an old authoritarian. This is Erich Honecker. He was the leader of East Germany for many, many years, until just shortly before the fall of the wall. About 125 people were shot and killed trying to cross no man's land to escape to the west during his regime. Countless others arrested, interrogated, tortured, imprisoned by the regime. That's old authoritarianism, where regimes held a monopoly over public life. One-party system, the state controlled the executive, ruled by a strong man, it usually was a man as well, or by the military. And so the state also controlled the economy, and the media was controlled by the state, and everyone knew that, and it was subject to strict censorship. Civil society was controlled by the party. Times have changed. And there's a new authoritarianism that has emerged, and so our example of this is Viktor Orban, who's the leader of Hungary. The new authoritarianism is different because it maintains the illusion of pluralism. It seeks to maintain the illusion of pluralism, but it exercises state control. And so it tries to limit the power of democratic institutions and opposition parties, tries to exercise state control very often in the economy, uses the economy to secure support, and it exercises state influence over the media, but tries to do it in much more subtle ways. And so it's more difficult to very clearly call that out. Under the new authoritarianism, independent media may survive, but doesn't have very much influence. We often see a very selective repression of NGOs. So, for example, using legislation that harasses and targets NGO civil society organizations, using tax authorities through tax investigations, maybe designating them as being foreign agents. That also rings a bit of a bell in Canada, too. And also political control of the court. And so in Hungary, for instance, part of their ongoing struggles with rule of law include their control of the courts. It's a less violent form of control. It doesn't mean it's not violent at all in Putin's Russia. There is still a non-zero chance that if you are an opponent of the regime, you may fall out of a window or fail to survive afternoon tea. So this still happens, but the attempt is to make it a more palatable form of authoritarianism. And Freedom House, which reports and monitors on democratic performance around the world, and their Breaking Down Democracy report, that they write that modern authoritarianism has succeeded where previous totalitarian systems failed due to their refined and nuanced strategies of repression, and also through the spread of illiberal policies in democratic countries themselves. And so their goal is to capture the institutions that undergird political pluralism and to dominate not only the executive and the legislature, but also to control those forces that limit and contain the state. And so the media, the judiciary, civil society, the commanding heights of the economy, and this, for me, this brings to mind the titans of industry who visit the White House and seek approval, as well as the security forces. We often hear talk also of populism, and populism tends to be used in a way that maybe sometimes conflated with authoritarianism. Sometimes we use it as a critique for democracy, but it's a tricky word to use. And so I want to just briefly address what is populism and is it anti-democratic? There are lots of definitions of populism, but the core elements that most people agree on is that it is a style of political appeal that, first of all, is anti-elite. It tries to divide the world into the pure people and the corrupt elite. And so it's really a representational claim. It's making a claim that a populist leader is the one who can understand and represent the will of the people. The French political scientist Catherine Fieschi describes it as, in terms of the appeal that it makes, as the politics of authenticity, which often then segs into the politics of shamelessness. And is it good for democracy? Well, it can be. There's nothing in populism that makes it essentially anti-democratic. Sometimes the elites are corrupt. They need to be opposed. Sometimes they're out of touch. Sometimes the people or segments of the population have been excluded so that populism can be emancipatory and inclusionary. And so populism calls for this idea of democracy that's more in tune with the wishes of the people. So it's kind of Rousseauian. But then this is where the danger lies, because populism then can quite easily be bad for democracy, because embedded in this idea that I alone can speak for the people is this danger that it starts to erode pluralism. I give this to my students, but I like the way that it characterizes it, and it draws upon the work of the political theorist Natalie Urbanati to describe what it is about how populism and authoritarian fits together. So populism can start out with so much promise. It seeks this direct representation of the people. It seeks to make these unheard voices heard. But then what starts to happen? We get this zone of democratic erosion, and that's where this representational claim, when it starts to turn to tools of majoritarianism, maybe using a referendum to elicit this direct idea of the people. Majoritarian tools to limit these other voices, and maybe pushing back against courts or bills of rights or charters of rights that can limit basic freedoms. And then we end up in authoritarianism, where it seeks to control and not represent. So then we get to this question of fascism. And this is kind of contentious because it falls into that category of, should we use this word? Is it, as Rebecca suggested, are we jumping to the extremes and therefore undercutting the power of our argument? I would describe fascism as an extreme form of authoritarianism, but it has other characteristics. And so it is extreme nationalism embedded historically, also with racism, misogyny, with power and violence at the center of this ideology. There's this special narrative around fascism that focuses on a nation in decline, a corrosion of values and of decadence. It relies on scapegoats, and so you can see how it can fit together with some of the tendencies that we see in populism, which require some scapegoats in that us and versus them politics. And so while authoritarianism erodes democracy and seeks power, authoritarianism can do this quietly in a business as usual way, and so we can almost not even notice that our state has become a bit authoritarian. Fascism, on the other hand, is far more revolutionary, and it seeks to upend social and institutional orders, smash it all, and build something new. Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, said in a 2024 interview with the New York Times that Trump fits the definition of a fascist. The Yale historian Timothy Snyder has also described Trump's politics as fascist. I think that when we use the term fascist, I think it's most useful here rather than as a category to describe a regime, because I don't think it describes regimes that we are seeing today yet, but it does describe, and I think it's very useful for describing a certain mode of appeal, for those elements that it invokes of the violence, of the misogyny, of the ultra-nationalism. And it's important, I think, also to be watchful for this, because fascism never really left us. I mean, we look here, we have Mussolini, that it was the first country in Europe to legally transition to fascism. Last year in Rome, in January 2024, hundreds of far-right activists gathered, and they gave the fascist salute. The ruling party in Italy, Brothers of Italy, is a modern reincarnation of the fascist MSI party, which was never disbanded after the Second World War. They did not undergo a denazification process similar to similar to Germany's denazification. And so it's always been there, and we can see this in public life, the Roman salutes that Elon Musk gave. And so we have to be watchful for that. And so the question is, when we look at Canada, where do we stand? I started this talk by saying that if we look at rankings of democracy, that Canada is near the top of the league table. Should we be worried? Should we be complacent about that? I mean, if we look at the country that sits at the very top of the table, which is Denmark, just last week, in their election, they saw an increase in the Copenhagen city election of far-right forces. I want to conclude by my own observations of what to watch for in Canada, where we're still far from the situation where we see in these other cases of autocratic backsliding, where we're seeing a disruption of and rolling back of democratic institutions. But what we have started to see in Canada is the precursor to that. And that is, so around, we have democratic institutions that limit the power of the state. But surrounding these, there are norms. Norms such as commitment to the democratic rules of the game, respect for the political legitimacy of the opposition. Another norm is a rejection of political violence and a rejection of limiting the civil liberties of our opponents. And those are absolutely crucial. And I would say that in Canada, the most important work that we can do is in the work that helps to defend and safeguard these norms that we continue to publicly discuss. And that strengthens the work of organizations like Parkland Institute, which is a great example of the type of civil society work and development that keep forces of opposition and pluralism, nonviolent discussion where we can disagree without killing each other. If we look at the example of Hungary, of how it slid to authoritarianism, scholars Veronica Engel and Eric Jones made a really interesting point that by the time that Hungary in 2011 revised its constitution to entrench the power of the Orban regime, the authoritarian shift had already happened, and it had already happened through this underlying shift in norms and the successful deployment of a narrative of illiberalism that distracted the public from its true intention. And so my colleague Feo will have, I think this is a nice segue into what you have to tell us about these democratic values, but also their public communication is absolutely essential. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. Certainly raising a lot of really important questions for us to continue to grapple with here in Alberta in this interesting set of weeks that we've had. Our next speaker, Dr. Feo Snagovsky, is going to present on Democracy Requires Democrats, Support for Democratic Values in Canada and Beyond. Dr. Snagovsky is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Alberta. His research focuses on the comparative analysis of elections and political behavior, and particularly in the role that political elites play in shaping identity and public opinion. And he's the project lead for Viewpoint Alberta, which is the largest publicly available survey project of Albertans' political attitudes and behaviors. And it's been invaluable for situating some of our work here at Parkland as well. So we're very grateful for the work that Feo and his colleagues are doing. He has a book forthcoming, so I encourage everyone to run out for that in May 2026, UBC Press. Who Cares About Representation, Race, Ethnicity, and Legitimacy in Westminster Democracies? Please welcome Dr. Feo.
The story I want to tell you starts in much the same way that Lori started hers. And this one starts in Greece around 1973, during a period of time called the Metapolitefsi, which was a period of roughly 2 years where people rose up and transitioned to democracy through student protest against the military junta. The details are different, but the first country to really kick this off, to really transition in this so-called third wave of democracy was Portugal. That was a really big domino to fall in the 1974 Carnation Revolution. Spain quickly followed suit, replacing their longtime dictator. This period of time that we've kicked off is really difficult to overstate, because over the span of this so-called third wave, more than 60 countries became democracies in a really short period of time. You had Ecuador, you had Argentina, you had Brazil, you had South Korea. This golden age of democratization led to a consensus that was emerging around the endurance and consolidation of democracy. And there's this famous paper written by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History. And it has now become infamous in political science circles. And Fukuyama was making the point that maybe we've come to a convergence of views. Maybe we've converged on this model. And the quote that is often circulated from this paper is, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." This is sort of like the democratic equivalent of, if you leave monkeys alone in a room, they'll eventually write Shakespeare. If you leave countries in a room long enough, they'll eventually converge on democracy. And at the time, this very optimistic, idealistic view had some traction, right? What Fukuyama was talking about when he meant democracy, was this form of human government that allows people to select leaders through free and competitive elections while guaranteeing political rights and civil liberties like expression and association. You have regular, non-violent, that word is key, violence here, and the mitigation of violence was at the heart of what made democracy so interesting and helpful for people. In the immediate period after Fukuyama wrote that article, he looked like a genius, right? You had the Berlin Wall coming down within months of that paper being published. You had pro-democracy revolutions in Czechoslovakia, in Russia. Russia was going through free and fair elections. You had Zambia, you had South Africa. And the hits kept on coming. You had Georgia, you had Ukraine, you had Kyrgyzstan. By the time we got to the early 2000s, when these color revolutions started going on, things kind of started slowing down. Each of these revolutions ultimately failed. And you had them slowing down even further. You know, Putin served as quote unquote prime minister from 2008 to 2012, where his colleague assumed the titular role of president. And it's easy to forget when that happened. Then when Putin first became president, that was a really hopeful sign. He seemed like he could be a reformer, and that didn't pan out at all. You had Jair Bolsonaro and Viktor Orban pioneering illiberal democracy, something that Laurie mentioned in her talk. The president of South Korea, very recently, 2024, tried to impose martial law and send the military into parliament. And you had Donald Trump, Kash Patel, and Pam Bondi weaponizing the Department of Justice. That's going on right now in the United States. As Laurie very clearly made the point in her talk, this current wave of democratic backsliding isn't happening through classic coups like they did in the good old days, but it's happening through executive aggrandizement, where elected governments systematically weaken the checks and balances on democratic institutions. You know, these examples are not cherry-picked, as Laurie mentioned. They're part of a broader trend. You have, 20 years ago or so, the number of countries that were becoming more free outweighed the number of countries that was becoming less free. And every subsequent year thereafter, we have seen a decline. More and more countries are becoming less free, and fewer countries are becoming more free. This trend can be seen in a lot of different dimensions. So the number of countries that was democratizing in 2004 was 26, and in 2024, 20 years later, it's only 19. And the number of countries autocratizing, becoming autocracies, is now more than 3 times the number that are becoming democracies. You see that in elements of democracy. So freedom of expression is deteriorating. In 2024, 44 countries have deteriorating freedom of expression, compared to just 7 in 2004. Freedom of expression was really improving 20 years ago. Now that is not the case. The quality of elections is seeing the same trend. And if you take all of this together, this period of about 65 years, you see this rapid growth in liberal democracy from around 1960 to 1990, where it really shoots up, and then we have this plateau. And again, when I say liberal democracy, I'm not just talking about a form of government that allows free and fair elections, but one in which we have rights and liberties that we enjoy vis-a-vis the state. And no matter how you measure it, this seems to be the case, that we not only plateaued, but are now decreasing. Canada is not immune from these trends, although they look different here. I think Laurie made the case very clearly, and I agree with her entirely, that Canada is still a robust democracy. We have it really good compared to some of the countries that we've been sort of referencing in our data sets here. But there are still really worrying signs that we need to pay attention to. So for example, when Pierre Poilievre was running for the leadership of the Conservative Party, we heard a lot of talk about quote unquote gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are code for institutions, the people that are responsible for the checks and balances that hold elected people to account. We saw the curtailing of political rights in Quebec, first through the Notwithstanding Clause, and this idea of freedom of religion being a key part of what makes liberal democracies liberal, rather than, there's nothing inherent about freedom of religion that is necessary for democracy, but it is necessary for liberal democracy. And closer to home in Alberta, we've seen the Notwithstanding Clause being invoked more and more. The Notwithstanding Clause is finally brings us to what I really want to bring your attention to today. Because the Notwithstanding Clause is perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional, but it was this get-out-of-jail-free card, this loophole to ensure parliamentary supremacy in our Constitution that was only supposed to be used in extraordinary circumstances. And it was meant to incur a political cost. Voters were meant to hold elected officials accountable to prevent the overuse of the Notwithstanding Clause to suspend rights and freedoms. And it seems like, for the most part, as provincial governments have made more extensive use of the Notwithstanding Clause, the electorate has kind of just yawned. It's been kind of like, whatever. And it's this yawning that I really want to bring your attention to today. Because the story of democratization and authoritarianism is most often thought about through political elites, through executive aggrandizement, through elected people subverting the elected system that brought them into power in the first place. But it's the people that underpin this system. It's the people that are meant to push back against this executive aggrandizement. And the evidence that I've seen that I find persuasive suggests that we have seen a deterioration of support for democracy among people in the world. And this is just the general electorate. This is not talking about political elites, but the people who live in democratic systems. And you see this trend being most pronounced when it comes to young people. Young people are increasingly becoming more and more skeptical of democracy. What you have behind me here is a graph by birth cohort of the number of people who agree that it is essential to live in a country that is governed democratically. From the 1930s, this was very, very high in Europe and in the United States, and has deteriorated steadily. The people who were born in the 1930s, the 1940s, 1950s, every subsequent generation has been less convinced that it is essential to live in a democracy than the one that comes before it. If we break this down and look at other countries, we look at Australia, we look at Great Britain, we look at the Netherlands, New Zealand, Sweden, the United States. In each of these countries, the trend looks the same. Every birth cohort is less convinced that it is essential to live in a democracy than the one that has come before it. When you look at the North American data and the global data writ large, this is support for democracy around the world by quartiles. And as you can see here, Canada and the United States in 2005 were in the upper quartile of countries that thought it was essential to live in a democracy, that democracy is the best form of government. And in 2015, a decade later, they've moved down. They're now in the third quartile. Depending on who you ask, this may or may not be a problem. There's this idea that critical citizens that are skeptical of the government, can hold government to account, or indeed are essential to holding government to account. When I look out into this room, I see a group of critical citizens, people that are probably quite skeptical of various forms of government, maybe a little bit distrustful. But what makes movements and governments succeed, democracy succeed, is people holding their elected officials to account while still supporting the underlying rules of the game that govern this conversation. So you can be critical and distrustful of a government, but still believe that elections and rights are the best way to choose who governs us, even if we disagree with everything that government has to say. An elected government has the right to govern because they won the election, even if we disagree with them. That's all well and good, but when those underlying values start deteriorating, when support for democracy, the principles of the regime start deteriorating, we start to get in trouble. Because there is robust political science evidence that support for the principles of democracy is causally related to both the emergence of new democracies, so countries becoming more free and more democratic, but also the endurance of democracy, countries staying democratic. Without people believing in the underlying rules of the game, neither of these two things happens. They are a necessary but not sufficient condition for both the emergence and endurance of democracy. The political science evidence we have on support for democracy tells us that some things help and some things hurt. And people's personal experience here really matters. So experience with successful democratic governments. Democracies breed their own support. The more successful your country is at enforcing democratic norms, the more people support those democratic norms. Better performing bureaucracies, a functioning civil service, stronger rule of law, experience with electoral and non-electoral participation. So going to vote and participating in politics in other ways helps people feel more favorable about democracy. And civil and religious involvement, being part of a religious organization, going to church, being part of your community association or community league. These are all things that help people feel better about the underlying system of government and democracy itself. But some things also hurt. Some things push us away from democracy in established democracies. So recent experiences of crime and negative assessments of public safety. We know that if people don't feel safe, they become less likely to support the regime that brought about those outcomes. So when you hear talk about public safety being an important issue in various elections, some of you may be like, great, and some of you may roll your eyes, but public safety causally related to support for democracy. We have nativism and ethnic antagonism, when people are antagonistic towards other groups and believe that their ethnic groups are superior to all others. That is related to lower support for democracy. And also lower levels of self-esteem. This self-esteem thing may seem like it's out of left field, that if you have lower self-esteem, you may be less likely to support democracy. It's actually really important because the thing that we really like, the thing that makes us feel good about ourselves in politics, is winning. We all really like to win. This is just human. We gain self-esteem benefits when our social group gains prestige. This is just psychology and sociology 101. When our social group does well, we feel good. This extends to politics. When our group wins, when our group gets elected, we feel good about ourselves. And it makes us more likely to tolerate things we otherwise might not tolerate. So Laurie talked about the case of Hungary. Supporters of Hungary's incumbent Fidesz party were much less likely to think that restrictions on freedom of expression that she mentioned in 2014 actually reduced the legitimacy of that election. Those who voted for Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil became more supportive of his moves to dismantle democratic checks and balances, even as they expressed greater support for democracy in principle. In other Latin American countries, those who voted for ruling parties were more likely to express greater support for democracy at the same time that they condoned actions by their preferred candidate to bypass the legislature and the courts. Supporters of both the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States exhibit a form of democratic hypocrisy and double standards. And this is the case in countries like Canada as well, where we punish partisan elites for democratic transgressions if they're on the other side, but condone democratic transgressions by co-partisans, and even rationalizing that behavior as democratic. We also know that people like to get the stuff that they ultimately wanted in elections. So in Australia and the United Kingdom, this is my own work, two countries that are often compared to Canada, voters are willing to tolerate elites who want to ignore Parliament and the courts if they get their preferred policy as a result. German voters are more likely to support illiberal candidates when they get more policy congruence with them. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we were more likely to accept executive aggrandizement when we agreed with lockdown policies and had greater levels of pandemic anxiety. This pattern of voters repeatedly tolerating anti-democratic behavior in return for policy gains suggests that voters are more likely to see democracy as instrumentally valuable, as a means to an end, rather than an end in and of itself. And this conversation about our partisan opponents really matters when it comes to how we see us and other groups in society. This is data from our Viewpoint Alberta survey project that was very helpfully called out by Rebecca a little at the start of this talk. This is a question about how much we like our partisan opponents. If you identify as a United Conservative or a New Democrat, you tend to really like your group, right? This kind of makes sense. The numbers here are kind of small, but you have like 2/3 of people saying, we like our group. But when it comes to the opposition, it is pretty different. So United Conservatives liking NDP supporters, most of them are kind of in the middle. Most of them are in the middle when they trust each other. And the same is the case for the other. And you can ask this question in different ways. Some people have different feelings about people they disagree with. How comfortable would you be with having a relationship with someone from each of the following groups? This is a measure of social distance. So if you identify as a conservative, only 36% of conservatives would be comfortable having a progressive marry into their family. Another 26 would be like, yeah, we can be friends. Then it gets down to next door neighbors, 13%, fellow Albertans, fellow Canadians, not even in the same country. Before you laugh, it is worse on the left. If you are a New Democrat, you are more likely to say that you don't want a conservative in the same country as you or in the same province as you than they are to say it back to you. We move in a polarized context from a situation in which our political opponents are not adversaries, but enemies. My colleague Jared Wesley has talked at length about this. Adversaries you want to defeat, enemies you want to destroy. Political competition is not a dialogue, but a war. So where do we go from here? There are some hopeful signs. It's not just all doom and gloom. I don't want to make you leave here totally despondent today. And we know that support for some values that correlate with democracy have increased over time. These are the sort of emancipative values that prioritize universal human freedoms, individual choice, equality of opportunities. These values have replaced authoritarian values like deference and conformity basically everywhere in the world. Successive birth cohorts are much more convinced that human freedoms, individual choice, equality of opportunity, that these are valuable things. And those are the building blocks of democracy. But we also know that losers' consent really matters. Even when we lose, we have to respect the process that got that outcome that we didn't like. If we try to undermine the underlying logic of the regime when we lose, it creates many, many more problems for us down the line. We also know that knowing more about democracy increases support for it. So if you understand what democracy is, you are more likely to support it. That's really good news. It means that we should be careful to call out real violations of democratic norms, rather than things we just don't like from a policy perspective. Not everything we don't like, policy-wise, is anti-democratic. Conversely, we should be really quick to praise people in other political parties and on other sides of the ideological spectrum when they engage in pro-democracy moves, when they reinforce those norms. We know that these things that we need to really pay attention for are things like undermining the legitimacy of the media, undermining anti-corruption authorities, undermining judicial independence, all the things that Laurie mentioned in her talk. And finally, resisting political polarization starts with each of us. You can't expect the other side, whoever the other side is for you, to respect democratic norms and to reduce political polarization if you don't do it yourself. Because remember, democracy requires Democrats. It is the people that make the regime democratic or not, and that force elites to abide by democratic norms and respect democratic principles. Thank you.
I will defer my facilitator's privilege of asking the first question.
I'm just wondering what role you see capitalism as having in this conversation.
I think actually that capitalism plays an enormous role in this, and this is one of this, it's a background condition which, I touched briefly on. I don't think I really emphasized it enough, and if we, had a graph of, to show us the impact of increasing inequality, we'd see this really shocking rise in inequality like over the past 20 years. I look a lot at European politics, and what we've seen is the voters fleeing from the center and going to extremes. And what that means for democracy is that some of these parties at the extremes don't buy into the constitutional rules of the game. One of the explanations for that has been the failure of traditional parties to deliver in terms of the economic outcomes that voters are experiencing, that people are losing out under modern capitalism. I think it is only going to get worse, because what we're seeing now is, in this new wave of capitalism, is an incredible concentration of power and wealth, yet also in things like data ownership and control over these structural elements which we will come to rely upon in our life. The problem is much more fundamental, and I think that democracy and capitalism have been in tension, and now it is, I think, really at crisis point.
I'm going to take a slightly different view, and I'm going to start with something that I think is going to be very unpopular in this room. Historically, capitalism has been an incredibly positive force on democracy over the last 60 years. Because for a long time, capitalism was seen as the main driver of democratization in the comparative literature. There was this thesis, and the statistical evidence is really strong, that as countries become more economically developed, they tend to become more democratic. So there is nothing inherently anti-democratic about capitalism. That said, I agree with a lot of what Laurie said as well. Modern capitalism looks quite different than capitalism has in the past. And there is for sure a pretty pernicious effect on democracy when people who have functionally unlimited resources have functionally unlimited influence on the political system. We see that a lot in the United States with the emergence of an oligarch class, which is pushing the United States in an anti-democratic direction. So I guess I would just like to say that the relationship between capitalism and democracy is nuanced. It's not inherently, there's nothing inherently anti-democratic about capitalism, but when it's taken to the logical extremes that we see in a place like the United States, it can have a really pernicious effect.
Yeah, capitalism today is very different from
Absolutely.
what we've seen before. We have oligarchy now, we have incredible concentration, and we have state capture. And this, together, corruption is one of the leading indicators of erosion of democratic performance and rule of law.
One of the characteristics of authoritarian or fascist regimes seems to be the total inability to tolerate any kind of dissent or any argument from their population. Reality doesn't exist for them. Reality is whatever the leader says it is. If the leader says something different next day, that's the new reality. It's like 1984. And I think this is most basically a rejection of critical thinking. And one of the characteristics of these very right-wing regimes, their science denial, the ultimate reality, especially with the fossil fuels, with Danielle and with Donald Trump, trying to deny or minimize any kind of anthropogenic climate change and any danger from that. That makes it virtually impossible for them to sort of deal with the real world. I just wonder if you think that a better science education in schools and critical thinking in general would help to undermine these fascist regimes or authoritarian.
I think you raise an excellent point, which we didn't quite touch on enough, in that democracy and having healthy dissent and disagreement also requires fundamentally that we inhabit the same universe. We inhabit the same reality. And these are very challenging times now. We live in the world of disinformation and of deep fakes, science denial. And so education certainly plays a very important role. But another, I think that what we need are governments to take very seriously their role in regulating the online space and coming up with AI strategies that are up to the task. And this is, I'm feeling a little bit pessimistic right now because the leading jurisdictions in which we're seeing the rapid AI development is the United States and China, are the two jurisdictions which do not have any meaningful regulation in place. I think the European Union is quite promising in this regard because it is trying to develop strategies to combat disinformation and deep fakes. And indeed, they not only consider these policies to be part of their policies of democratic defense, but they even lump these into common and foreign and security policies. So they regard that as integral to their stability and defense as well.
I hate to be the one to say, but the political science evidence on education is actually super clear that it is not the silver bullet we think it is, unfortunately, right? The level of political knowledge in the world has not increased. Canada has not increased, the United States has not increased as a result of increasing education. The idea that if only they knew better, if only they had the right knowledge, they would change their minds, simply does not work. And we saw that in full display over the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We thought if only people had the right information, then they would change their minds. And instead, I would like to suggest to you that while education, Lori and I make a living, on the premise that education is a positive thing, and I'm not saying that it isn't. It is for sure a positive thing. But it needs to go beyond that. It needs to go to people's feelings and meeting people where they're at and how they feel about things, not just what they think.
So we have governance institutions at very local levels, which most people interact with on a daily basis. So I'm thinking like our unions, strata boards, student associations. How much do you think eroding democracy within those institutions has an impact on people's norms and values towards democracy overall or at a broader federal level?
That's a great question. We don't necessarily have data on it. I would think it would matter because we do know that experience with successful democratic governance makes people feel better about democracy. And the inverse is also true. Experience with bad democratic governance may make you less likely to support democracy. We know that it's not quite as simple. Like if your community association is run in a way that you don't like, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to storm the Capitol, but definitely having more and more pro-democracy experiences is helpful for developing those positive attitudes.
And I would just add to that. I mean, this is my bit of optimism for a Saturday afternoon is when I look at the United States, for example, and the democratic erosion that we're seeing there, I think that the really encouraging bright spot is to see these areas of resistance and democratic strength that we're especially seeing at the municipal level, at the state level. And so federalism can be quite good this way because it gives us multiple sites for democracy. And just a slightly tangential one, but I was thinking this morning about German federalism, actually, because I was thinking about the rise in separatist sentiment in Alberta. And interestingly, in Germany, their constitution has a clause regarding loyal cooperation within the federation. And so, setting out the rules of the game, which for them includes a commitment to working productively together, even when they disagree. And I thought, what an interesting, and I don't often think about that bit of the German constitution, but it struck me this in our times for Canada. I thought, it may be an ideal worth reflecting upon in terms of, as Canadians, articulating our commitment to the constitutional framework and rules of the game.
I too wanted to reach for my anti-anxiety meds, but before I took them, the thing that resonated with me was democracy requires Democrats. In this increased polarization times that we're living in, what strategies can you suggest for us on an individual basis to be able to counter this and to practice the philosophy of Ubuntu, which I think will go a long way in making it less of a polarized world?
Thanks for the question. Your check's in the mail. I think we need to be really careful with how we see other people in the political system. I think that is a prerequisite to successful democratic governance and to having pro-democracy attitude. The gentleman over here in his remarks talked about tolerance. I think tolerance is really, really important. And you can't expect someone to tolerate you if you don't tolerate them. A great example right now, I'm writing a book with some colleagues on Alberta separatism. And as part of that project, we have been going to rallies for Alberta independence and talking to people and then doing follow-up interviews. Now, I personally am not a separatist. I think that Alberta should not become an independent country, but I'm talking to a lot of people at those rallies and in my interviews that have a very different view. And the big takeaway from that research so far that I can tell you is that they're not evil. They don't get up in the morning thinking, how can I screw it up for everyone else in this province? How can I really get those libs? Everyone's the hero in their own story. The people there who are going to those rallies, who want Alberta independence, really believe that it's the best thing for the province. They're coming from a place, usually, for the most part, of good faith. I just happen to disagree with them. And not seeing people like that as evil, even if you disagree with them, is the first step to reducing political polarization and increasing our collective support for a system of government where we can all coexist and come up with proposed solutions together.
I want to guess maybe end on an optimistic note, and I wondered if you could comment on successful resistance and reversals of this democratic backsliding. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, Poland or Brazil. As we study those, perhaps we can learn what are the effective strategies to resist democratic backsliding and move back toward more democracy.
Thank you. I think, absolutely Poland's a great example of that, where by quite a narrow margin, the party of Donald Tusk won their election, and so it's held authoritarianism at bay. They reversed many of the government measures that had eroded rule of law through interference in the judiciary. I don't know if a success story maybe counts in the UK earlier this week, that a politician for Reform UK was sentenced to prison for accepting bribes from a Kremlin operative. But that at work. For me, the success stories that I see have been electorates. If we look at Western Europe, where we've seen a rise in radical right parties, that voters are rejecting that, and voters are turning away. And so in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, his party had previously won the election. It would have been unthinkable 25 years ago, in the year 2000, all of the then EU member states decided to freeze their diplomatic relations with Austria when they brought a far-right party into government. And so, our norms have shifted, and these far-right parties are now considered legitimate actors in our midst. But I think the public is not buying that message. My take is that we're seeing the public vote for these parties as a protest. They're dissatisfied, but I don't see it as a sign that the electorates are actually happy with what those parties have to offer. For me, that's the good news. The task ahead is that I think that other parties and pro-democratic parties have to really think carefully about how to deliver for citizens and to tackle these really complex problems, to deal with that policy satisfaction, which Feo had mentioned, is that at the root of a lot of this anti-democratic sentiment.
There are actually lots of examples of successful resistance. In Alberta, when premiers in the past have thought about using the notwithstanding clause to limit rights and freedoms, there was pushback from political elites. There's pushback from voters that ultimately made those efforts unsuccessful. You think of Brazil, right? Jair Bolsonaro is no longer the president. Brazil today looks very different than it did 10 years ago. You think about South Korea, when the South Korean president tried to impose, he did impose martial law. People took to the streets. Parliamentarians flooded into parliament anyway. And that president now facing criminal charges. The United States, you can think of as a success story that is going through peaks and valleys. It's not true that the United States has never been as polarized as it is now. The US had a civil war. They were pretty polarized there. Things got better after that. It's easy to forget McCarthyism. In the United States, McCarthyism created a really, really polarized electorate, and things got better after that peak, right? So it can get better. Success is possible.
And I'd like to thank our two speakers, which is how we like to do things here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here, for sharing with us your knowledge today and giving us a lot to think about.